The Xbox Series S retails for $299, which is 40% lower than the X-Fridge and Space Station 5. And for people who want a machine that can run Game Pass and give them access to day-and-date Xbox exclusives through that service, it's a much easier pill to swallow than its bulkier older brother. There's a clear demographic that this console is trying to corner, and it's a demographic that I fall into. I bought the Series S on release, and I don't regret that decision. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of Game Pass, there's a lot of Xbox games coming up that I have my eye on, and I feel like if I sprung for the Series X, it would have been a little overkill considering I also nabbed a PS5. I'm happy with my Series S, but the more time passes, the more clear it's become that its existence is potentially detrimental to the wider industry, and might actually affect consumers of other consoles even more than it hinders itself. Behind its appealing price tag, it's easy to argue that the Xbox Series S is secretly devaluing new generation games. In response to the backlash around Gotham Knights running at just 30 FPS on current-gen consoles, a Rocksteady dev named Lee Devinald fired shots at the potato that was the Series S, claiming that it was barely an improvement over last-gen consoles and was hamstringing current-gen development because of this. I should mention that Rocksteady isn't developing Gotham Knights, that's WB Montreal, so this wasn't the official excuse that the dev team was using for the 30 FPS limit, but the bold claims made by Devinald got a lot of attention and spurred a lot of questions, like why would the Series S affect other consoles, and why are PC games able to have sliding graphics options, but the Series S all of a sudden backs you into a corner performance-wise on more powerful systems. And I feel like we need to pull this apart a bit further, because it feels like the general discourse is the result of having slightly adjacent arguments that make it less clear where the actual problems lie. Where we naturally have to start are the actual specs of the Series S, which to most people look like if you just slammed your keyboard randomly and came out with some sequence of letters and numbers that mean nothing, but that's okay. We're only going to be focusing on these two figures and comparing them to the Xbox Series X, the more premium current-gen console, and the Xbox One and One X. The GPU has been one of the main culprits that developers have pointed to as the bottleneck of this console, with a processing speed that quadruples the original Xbox but is 3 times lower than the Series X and a little over 2.5 times lower than the PS5. What's even crazier though is that it's actually also lower than the Xbox One X, the Pro version of the previous console generation. And switching over to memory, we can see that the Series S barely edges out the base Xbox in this department and matches the One X, giving a lot of credence to this half-step notion that Devinald mentioned. There are architectural improvements to this console that make it better than the One X, and these figures aren't the whole story. Hardware is super confusing to get a full picture of, but those raw numbers still aren't pretty when making these direct comparisons. Looking at it all side by side, it doesn't seem like the floor for current generation consoles is considerably higher than that of the last one, and other developers like Ian McClure from Surgeon Simulator team Bossa Studios have chimed in saying this restriction has led to a lot of developers having a lot of meetings trying to get the Series S requirements for their games dropped. I feel like it's natural for people to respond to this by saying, well, I get why something like Gotham Knights might struggle to run on the Series S, but how does that mean my much more powerful Series X or PS5 can't run this game at 60 frames? Especially if there are options at lower resolutions to play at 60 FPS on PC with rigs that aren't up to snuff with current gen consoles. And those people are honestly right to be confused, because this falls on the dev team making odd decisions more than it does on the direct restrictions of Xbox, since one of those two things was already a fixed variable. But the distinction that needs to be made about this whole argument, past just Gotham Knights, is that developers aren't saying that all console versions are stuck with the same performance just because one is lagging behind. The problem lies with minimum specifications. Remedy Entertainment's communications director Thomas Puha has mentioned that minimum specs are really important to the development of a game. You can't start at peak performance and then cut down textures and resolution as you lower the requirements, because that doesn't take into account the engine, how many physics-based calculations your game is performing, the density of assets, and plenty more. Little known fact, game assets are actually made based off the lowest rig that you want to run on, and their sample rates and other tweaks are increased with better hardware, but the base of what you create and the initial compromises are dictated heavily by minimum specs because the game has to run on those systems. If you don't do this, or you don't do it well at least, you wind up with situations like Cyberpunk, which absolutely could not be supported by lower end hardware. You needed a supercomputer for this game to run properly, and it even led to Xbox and Sony mass refunding or banning the game from being sold on their system for extended periods of time because it simply was not built to work on those consoles. Not really. You can aim big, you can design for more powerful systems off the bat, but you can't magically move a couple of numbers around to get it to work with less powerful ones. So at the end of the day, minimum requirements will always dictate what the game compromises along all systems. This is especially tough for a game like Gotham Knights, which wanted to have untethered co-op, meaning that you and your friend could be on opposite sides of the map, and the game would allow for that. You aren't bound to a certain distance of the host. And this means that way larger parts of the city need to be rendered and displayed at any one time than would otherwise be the case with a single-player game. You have double the amount of NPC movements, particle effects, player physics, city architecture, all running at the high resolution they wanted with ray tracing. That level level of complexity and multitasking is why it's not reasonable to compare it to something like, say, Forza Horizon 5 or Spider-Man Miles Morales, which were tied down by even older hardware but didn't need to be capable of performing the same type of tasks that are less compatible with old tech. Not to mention they were built off proprietary engines that had been made specifically to work well with the family of consoles they appeared on, avoiding some issues that third-party engines might get caught up in. Gotham Knights is kind of a different beast. In fact, there aren't many open-world untethered co-op games that we can point to make the claim, hey, they were able to work with this, why weren't you? And one of the only studios we know working on one of these games in the future is Rocksteady, who unsurprisingly were the first defenders of Gotham Knights. Thomas Puha was clear in stating that different engines did different things which worked better with different kinds of projects, so playing the comparison game kinda gets you nowhere. WB Montreal's goals may have been possible to implement with the higher FPS if the minimum system you started base development on had the power or the innovative rendering techniques of the Series X and the PS5, because those systems could then inform your solutions to problems, but that's really not the case here. Looking at the PC side of things for the game, you notice that eventually some builds can run it at 60 FPS, but unless you're hitting low settings in a lot of areas that are largely unacceptable on consoles, I'm talking past resolution and into textures, shadows, lighting, etc., the only point where you hit 60 FPS is when you have a system that contains a graphics card which is more expensive on its own than the entire consoles you're stacking them up against. There's no telling what Gotham Knights might have been able to pull off with superior minimum specs, aka not the Series S, but as it stands, without a lot of work that alters some of their decisions from top to bottom, WB Montreal can't really offer a performance mode just by turning the resolution down. It might be something that they're working on, but it's not a quick patch by any means. That's not all to say that Gotham Knights is excused, however. Not only would I argue that the decisions they made on what to prioritize are deeply flawed, I think it's ridiculous to put ray tracing ahead of smoother FPS, for example, and it's a clear play at trying to hit more new tech buzzwords, but the game also clearly can't figure out how to optimize itself even within its desired constraints, given that untethered co-op runs like garbage. If you're wondering why they didn't bump the FPS to 60 or even 40 for solo play and then locked it at 30 for co-op, it's not because they tied up solo and co-op to the same frame rate. Solo is in fact smoother. Instead, what actually happens is co-op starts running at 20 frames per second pretty consistently, and if you start veering too far away from the other player, it dropped to well under 15 frames for me, and this wasn't a once in a while thing, this was consistently a problem. So really, the conclusion that this game gives at least is that the Series S likely contributed to Gotham Knight's performance, but WB Montreal also made a lot of errant decisions on what to prioritize and what to leave behind, and was unable to even hit those marks for the systems that it knew it would be releasing on, which means that both sides of the argument were likely right in some capacity. There is a bottleneck, but some devs do struggle to optimize their games. Gotham Knights isn't the only game to suffer from the Series S's limitations, however. Notably, Dying Light 2 had issues with the console, A Plague Tale Requiem came out with 4K 30 FPS and no performance mode, which may lead back to this problem, and Digital Foundry mentioned that many developers found the memory limitations to be a pain to deal with, especially with more dense worlds. There are arguments to be had about whether some studios may be using the Series S as a scapegoat for their own poor work. After all, Knights was originally planned as a cross-gen title, meaning that harsh limitations were always part of the picture, they just seem to have fumbled the performance end of things. But as we move out of this transition period and into developers making fully fledged titles with the hopes of using the full power of the new consoles, this Series S requirement becomes much more of a glaring issue. id Software engine designers Billy Khan and Axel Knighting mentioned that torpedoing the resolution helps out a bit, but there are other problems that limited memory presents which require you to remove or tweak elements from the game. Also directly mentioning how scaling on PC is a misunderstood concept and reaffirming the fact that assets are made with minimum specs in mind. The way Knighting words this points to the major forthcoming problems with the S as the console generation continues, saying of the superior performance on better systems, increasing sample counts a bit here and there for high settings isn't what you truly could have done with more power. The problem isn't that devs can't eventually find workarounds to less powerful consoles. We've seen the ends of the last two generations produce games that absolutely blow launch titles out of the water visually. We are not stuck with 4K and 15 FPS for every game going forward. Devs will adjust, but the current potential of games is undeniably going to be limited by the lowest common denominator. Already we've seen minimum PC specs for new AAA games hit the 2000 series of Nvidia's graphics cards, and these will continue to increase as the generation continues. And eventually we're just going to entirely denounce older PC hardware, but the Series S can't be treated in the same way. Teams may call up Xbox and ask for the system to be dropped from their requirements, but I don't see a situation where Xbox would allow that. This is marketed as a next generation console, and people have bought it to play next generation games. If they drop that support, the backlash would be unheard of. The whole entire console is a bald-faced lie at that point. The Series S likely can't be outgrown until we hit the next generation, and that means that current gen games will be relegated to upscaled versions of titles that can run on the Series S, rather than innovative titles that do things that we've never seen before using the true power of current gen consoles, which is the frustration that devs are experiencing. We could be doing so much more, but this thing is clinging to our ankles. I also have to weigh in and say that I find the notion of this all being a big excuse a bit confusing. Why would developers be asking to drop a console that would be providing them with more sales? sales. And why would they be worried about this before the console ever even released, or during a period where they haven't been met with criticism of their own performance issues? The problem definitely exists, and now all that's left to see is how big of a problem it'll become in the end. I'm really interested to see the discrepancy between PlayStation exclusive titles and multi-platform or Xbox exclusives near the end of the PS5/Xbox Series lifecycle, which already had a decent gap back on the PS4, but may become even more drastic now with a clearer technical anchor on one end despite the two flagships being comparable in power. Regardless of how that checks out though, one thing that we can gather from engine designers, programmers, VFX artists, and nearly everyone involved in game development is that the Xbox Series S, as appealing as it is from a financial point of view to the individual consumer, is actively giving us worse experiences across the board than we would have had without it. The counterweight to its incredible value is the secret devaluation of all current generation systems. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like, join the Discord, it's in the description, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.